Chapter 115, Aftermath, Hanyu's POV. It felt like the fight had gone on for hours. Shouts occasionally pierced the night, Marcus and Antony snapping at each other in words Hanyu didn't understand, but mostly there were only the sounds of their feet on the rocks and their bodies smashing into one another. Asao stirred a little. Should Hanyu try to drag him away from the fight? He thought he'd read somewhere that you shouldn't move a person who was unconscious, but if Antony lost... No, he mustn't think like that. Why would Antony have started this fight if he hadn't known he could win? Hanyu needed to have more faith in his master. But Antony was screaming now in a high, desperate way that sounded as if he were being killed. He wasn't, was he? Of course he couldn't actually die. Well, he could, but it wouldn't happen tonight, would it? Marcus wouldn't kill his lord and lover, would he? A new voice broke into the cacophony, and Hanyu could have screamed with frustration at his inability to see what was going on. Instead of screaming, he choked over a soft sob. Still, that meant that someone on the beach had heard them, didn't it? Surely others were coming. It would all work out, and they would be saved, and... I haven't heard Antony's voice for a long time. Antony? He asked timidly, and then immediately cursed himself. I shouldn't draw attention. I need to look after Asao. I've got to think before I speak. Consider someone else for a change. Asao was still breathing, but even in the darkness, Hanyu could feel how cold his skin was getting. He suspected that his friend's prolonged loss of consciousness had less to do with the throttling he'd received, and more to do with the hot blood soaking his clothes. How long had Asao been bleeding, and from how many injuries? Hanyu had done his best to staunch the flow, but given the poor visibility, he didn't know whether he'd found all his friend's wounds. Something heavy skittered suddenly in the stones right before Hanyu's knees. He shrieked, blood running like ice, but then he caught the gleam of pale hair in the darkness. Oh gods, Antony! He seized the god's shoulders, ran his fingers over his face to be sure it was him. The contours of his face felt swollen and sticky wet, and Hanyu shuddered at the feeling. Antony lay on the ground, not resisting his touches, but the sound of fighting went on. The newcomer must have challenged Marcus. And good thing, too. It didn't seem as though the fight had been going in Antony's favor. This is bad. Hanyu wished desperately for some light so he could at least see what kind of state the god was in. The fact that Antony was literally crawling over the rocks and hadn't spoken seemed like plenty of indication, however. What have I done? A horrible feeling of déjà vu washed over Hanyu. He had been reckless and run off alone, and now Antony and Asao lay beside him, battered to insensibility, while he sat there without so much as a fucking scratch. How could he have let this happen twice? Marcus had been right. This was just the sort of man he was. A man who ignored the potential consequences of his actions because those consequences were never his to bear. A man who let his loved ones suffer for his selfishness and idiocy. A parasite. He curled over Antony's prostrate form. What happened? Oh, gods, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. A strange, garbled noise came from the god, accompanied by something wet splattering Hanyu's knees. This is all my fault, Hanyu thought again. He didn't deserve to touch either of the men bleeding onto the rocks, but he couldn't bear to leave Antony face down on the ground like that. He lifted the god's head and settled it in his lap, cringing at the feeling of his robes being immediately soaked. Just then, Marcus shouted something in a sharp, hoarse voice. A victory cry? Hanyu trembled, but all he could do was huddle over Asao and Antony and pray frantically that somebody else would come to save them. Had he ever felt so frail, so pathetically human? Hanyu? He startled at the voice from the darkness. It sounded strange, but soft and calm. "This is Felix." "Oh, thank all the gods, but you especially." Hanyu had never experienced such a powerful feeling of relief. It knocked the breath from his lungs like a blow. He sagged over his charges, weeping even harder than before. "Marcus has surrendered," the wonderful, perfect god went on. "I'm going to stay here with him, but Theo should be joining us any minute. She just needs to find a harbor to secure the boat. Are you all right?" "Antony and Esau are hurt," Hanyu blubbered. Marcus started to say something in the god's language, but he didn't get far. "In Taishan, please," Felix interrupted. "I'd like Hanyu to hear your version of events as well, so he can tell me if he disagrees with any of them." Marcus snarled something else Hanyu couldn't understand, only for Felix to say, "Well, I didn't find Hanyu tenderizing our commander, so that does give his word a little added weight. Taishan, please." Hanyu didn't get to hear what Marcus might have said next, because that was when Lord Theodora arrived, flying over the stones so fast that Hanyu didn't even hear her coming until she was dropping to her knees beside him. "Holy fuck!" she cried, her deadpan voice cracking wildly. "Hanyu, what? Antony and Esau and Hanyu, what happened? Are you all right?" Even in the darkness, he could see that her hands flew everywhere. First they were checking Esau's pulse, then brushing gently over Antony's hair, and finally settling on Hanyu's shoulders, big and rough and so comforting that he burst into a fresh flood of tears. "This is all a misunderstanding." Marcus's butter-smooth tone was a little more strained than usual, but there was no other indication that a giant of a man was pinning him to the ground. "Antony attacked me first. He flew at my throat in the middle of a normal conversation. He's not in his right mind. I think the strain of Titus's condition has proved too much for him. I'm afraid he'll be a danger to himself when he wakes." The horrible god sounded completely sincere. He was completely sincere, Hanyu realized. For once, Marcus believed every word he was saying. "Theo, with Antony unconscious and Marcus under suspicion, that makes you acting captain," said Felix. "What do you say we do?" Theodora stiffened and squared her shoulders, but Marcus's protest cut out whatever she'd been about to say. "That's ridiculous! You said yourself that she wants me dead. How can she possibly be expected to make fair decisions?" "I'm not making any decisions about you," Lord Theodora spat. "We can figure out what happened later. Right now, we need to get everybody medical attention. I'm going to the storehouse to get help. I'll send someone for Julia, then come right back. Is that all right with you, Hanyu? You'll be safe with Felix here." Hanyu could only nod and hope that she would be back soon. She was, and when Lord Theodora returned, she had a crowd in her wake. Hanyu couldn't help relaxing a little as he watched her giving orders and dispersing everyone on various errands. It was even better when, between bursts of instructions, she settled her hand back on his shoulder. "Everyone is safe now." One of her orders was that someone bring a torch, and it felt like the kindest mercy Hanyu had ever been granted. Or it did, up until he got a good look at Antony and Esau. Lord Theodora was in the middle of speaking to two unfamiliar gods, but as soon as Hanyu gasped, she was at his side, leaving them blinking in confusion. "Are you all right?" she asked urgently. And now that there was light, he could see the unnecessary, undeserved concern on her face. "I'm just fine," Hanyu choked. Because of course he was. Of course he hadn't brought any harm down on his precious self with his recklessness. Like any proper parasite, he'd shuffled the suffering off onto the two dear men who lay broken before him. Gods, Esau's eye! Hanyu couldn't bear to look anymore. It felt like the worst kind of cowardice. After causing all this, the least he should be able to do was look at the results, but he didn't think matters would be helped if he threw up on the patients. When he lifted his shameful gaze, his eye was drawn to the other hub of chaos. Felix knelt behind Marcus, his face grimly intent on his prisoner. The horrible god's arms were crossed over his chest, and Felix held his hands behind his back, making it look as if Marcus were tied up somehow. Both gods looked much the worse for wear. Felix had a cut on his forehead that was dripping blood into his left eye, but he didn't even blink, so closely was he watching Marcus. Marcus, for his part, looked much worse. He was bleeding profusely from his nose and mouth. His lips were slashed with multiple splits, and the skin around both his eyes looked a little puffy. However, he wasn't trying to look at Felix or Lord Theodora or any of the other gods. His eyes were fixed on Hanyu, and it was impossible not to shrink before the naked hatred there. "This is a coup," he snarled, seeming to address the other gods, though he was still watching Hanyu. "Theodora and my former second have announced their intention to kill me. They clearly mean to seize power while Lord Antony is incapacitated." "Incapacitated by your hand," Felix rumbled, his soft voice dangerous. "I merely defended myself when attacked," protested the horrible god. "Our commander is obviously wild with grief over Lord Titus's condition, and—" "All right, what's the trouble?" Lord Julia's voice wasn't loud, but it landed like a whip. "I know you didn't call us on land 40 minutes before sunrise for anything less than an emergency, isn't that right?" She marched into the torchlight with Cloelia and Thad on her heels and glowered ferociously down at Felix and Marcus. Thad, however, was looking at the rest of the gathering, and his eyes widened when they fell on Hanyu and his insensible charges. "Asau!" the small god cried, launching himself the few steps to kneel beside them. "What? Oh gods, what happened?" His lovers were barely an instant behind him, all of Lord Julia's bad temper disappearing at once. Finally, Hanyu found his voice. "Will he live?" he begged as the healer checked his friend over. Lord Julia didn't answer him for what seemed like an eternity. A soft hand gripped his, and Hanyu turned to see Thad staring down at Asau, clutching Hanyu's fingers in one hand and Cloelia's in the other. "Julia, please," the god whispered, and the anguish in his voice matched what Hanyu was feeling so perfectly that he couldn't help squeezing Thad's fingers. Finally, Lord Julia spoke. "He's lost too much blood. We need to get him to my infirmary right now." With that, she scooped Asau's limp body into her strong arms and whirled back towards the beach. Marcus cried out in protest. "What about Antony?" he demanded, even as Felix shot him a warning look. "He was acting wild and erratic. You need to stay with him." "I don't tell you how to brutalize people," Lord Julia spat, glaring down at him so fiercely that even Felix flinched. "So don't try to tell me how to put them back together." With that, she was gone. "Thad, take Antony and Hanyu," Lord Theodora ordered. "Cloelia, you and I are going to help Felix with the prisoner. Julia was right. We all need to get under cover immediately." Thad, still looking gaunt and stricken, bent and pulled Antony into his arms. Hanyu found himself reluctant to surrender the god to anyone. He wanted to lift his master as tenderly as Lord Julia had taken Asau. But when he tried to stand up, he found that his own legs wouldn't even hold his own weight, let alone anybody else's. He flopped back down, banging his ass painfully on the stones. "Good," he thought ferociously. "Maybe I'll bruise. Maybe I'll have a single fucking bruise to show for the night when I got Asau and Antony sliced to ribbons." A god, his master, had taken a beating for him. Not once, but twice now. The temple had never trained him for this kind of situation. How was he supposed to respond? Was he supposed to pour out his gratitude or his remorse the next time he was permitted to fall at Antony's feet? Both feelings filled him, seething hot and demanding until he felt like he would fly apart if he couldn't express them. But which was acceptable to voice? "If Asau dies, there won't be any question. It'll be nothing but remorse and apologies, now and for the rest of my miserable life." It was Lord Theodora herself who ended up helping Hanyu to his feet, once Felix assured her that he and Cloelia were perfectly capable of handling Marcus on their own if he got unruly. Marcus showed no indication of doing so, allowing himself to be bundled into a boat by his two large captors with no struggle, only an air of dignified martyrdom. Still, Lord Julius sent them ahead and followed in her own boat, Hanyu in tow, to make sure she could keep an eye on them. Lord Julia's skiff was already little more than a dot in the distance. She must have been rowing for all she was worth. Hanyu didn't dare speak to Lord Theodora as she rowed. He didn't deserve to. Instead, he waited for the inevitable explosion. She knows Antony didn't send me there. She must have realized that I sneaked away. She saw what my disobedience cost. And after she was so kind and called me her friend, she must be so disappointed in me. Hanyu? The sea god's voice was flat and effectless as ever, but he saw her eyes gleaming in the light of the torch. I have had a very bad night. He flinched. I'm sorry, my lord. Could you do something to cheer me up? She asked, ignoring his lame attempt at an apology. Oh, yes! A chance to atone, in however minor a way, to even one of the many people that he had hurt and inconvenienced with his selfishness today was not to be passed up. Please just tell me how! Lord Theodora nodded, sniffled, rowed. Could you describe what it was like when Felix punched the hell out of Marcus? Now that was a cheering thought. However, there wasn't any torch, confessed Hanyu. I couldn't see the fight. Lord Theodora groaned. Oh, that must have been so frustrating, to be just a few feet from Marcus getting his ass beat like a rug, and not even able to savor the view. That's it. This night is trash for both of us. A total loss. She released one of her oars just long enough to open an arm to Hanyu invitingly. And even though he knew that she was miserable too, and probably didn't feel like being touched, he couldn't stop himself from taking advantage of just one more person's kindness that night. After all, how often could a parasite expect to get an invitation? He huddled against her sturdy body, face hidden in her shoulder, all the way back to the ship.